All right, welcome back. Father Deacon Ananias, Father Deacon Dr. Ananias joins me. Excuse me. I'm depriving you of your proper titles. CPA, CIA, CCP, should those all be on there as well? All of your alphabet acronyms? Did I leave any out? SSPX.
I feel like with the James Bond, I need to put up my Russian passport here.
What's your Russian code name? Dugan? Are you your Russian code name? Dugan?
Here's when my Dugan.
That's your great, dude? Your Dugan pass.
My Dugan pass right there.
So
let me in.
When you come to Russia, Dugan sits there at the check-in gate, and he literally checks every person in, and he looks at you and he says, "You have good beard, you can pass. You look Russian, you can pass." There's only one guy checking in.
When I go to Russia, when I go into Russia, Dugan's the dude with the sign that says FDA. You know what, like
the guy that picks you up in the limo. He picks you up in the limo and takes you to McDonald's. This is the Russian McDonald's.
Yeah, that's right. When I was in Russia, I did take a picture of. They had all these ads for like billboard ads for Papa John's Pizza, and it was like this hockey player with like a missing tooth, and I'm like. So I took a bunch of pictures of them. I'm like, well, these are hilarious.
Did you taste the vodka in Russia? Does it taste different, or is it all the same everywhere?
I made the mistake of, like, we were at a hotel.
So you ordered wine coolers, and you ordered Zimas.
I just ordered Bartles and James all day.
What's the Russian Zima? Right. You ordered the Russian Zima.
They had like this really nice spread at one of those hotels for breakfast, and then they had like bottles of vodkas kind of like set up like cannons and stuff. And I asked my spiritual father, and I'm like, vodka for breakfast? And he's like, well, the Russians and blah blah blah. And I said, well, can I get your blessing to try vodka for breakfast in the morning? It was the worst mistake I've ever made. Because of course, like, I was just like, I want to go back to bed.
Are you being serious? Like, there's actually an option for vodka at breakfast?
They drink vodka for breakfast.
Wow, that's
and
crazy.
My spiritual father was telling me, like, well, you got to see, like, a lot of these guys are just like out manual labor, and so they like, you know, you're just burning through and working it off and stuff like that. I'm like, yeah, because I mean, I don't want to drink alcohol for breakfast, man. I was just
that sounds terrible.
I want to go to bed. It's awful.
Yeah, it sounds terrible, and it reminds me of in Italy, like the odd choices they have for breakfast in Italy. There's always like a million like crumpets and cakes, super soggy bacon, which doesn't even look cooked, which is weird, and then like cold ham, and cold eggs. Like the eggs are never hot; they're cold. It's just a weird breakfast idea. I don't know. Anyways,
yeah, I was on a pilgrimage, so I wasn't actually searching for like distilleries and tasting Russian vodka and stuff like that. But when I go back, I'll make a habit of finding. It'll be like an Indiana Jones, the search for the holy vodka.
All right, so tonight we're going to discuss the new paper of that Father Deacon Dr. Ananias has written, which is, I thought he mentioned this idea a few months ago. I thought it was a great idea for a paper to address some of the specific challenges that we've heard in recent years to the transcendental argument for God's existence. And a lot of these revolve around higher level argumentation and really a basic kind of idea that I think you had said Russ Mannion pointed out to you a while back, which is that it's really just asking the question of like, what's the reason for reasoning itself? And when we think about it in that way, it's actually prior to any of the atheistic argumentation that they might even engage in, because you're not even allowing them to sort of make the first move, which any first move is going to assume, again, reasoning. So if we're asking questions about reasoning itself, that's a perfect kind of segue into the domain of tag. So do you want to how do you want to kick it off, and maybe was there certain discussions you had that prompted you to have this as your paper topic?
Yeah. So I'm really indebted to Russ Mannion too, and just to let everybody know, he did pass away last week. So keep him and his family in your prayers. My godson, who is dear friends with Russ and did the dialogue group with, they were working on a book. And so I've been in correspondence with them and reading some other articles that most people haven't seen. Because what I was trying to think about is what was really good about Russ Mannion is his psychology, the ability to grasp the kind of psychological component of the other person, to kind of get to the question behind the question and stuff like that, and then reduce it, what would seemingly be really complicated, to um, a really kind of basic way of like explaining stuff.
Yeah, I like this
And
intro.
Russ
This
was a
this
man.
intro sentence at the top. The hardest problem is convincing people. The problem is not hard at all, but simple. That's a good. Yeah, that's a
Oh, that's
perfect.
me.
Yeah, I'm saying that's a perfect introductory sentence.
But that's kind of like channeling the, Russ Mannion. Let me give you an example of where he could take something that apparently would be really complex and then boil it, and it relates to this opening kind of quote that you gave. There's no purely rationalistic, rational argument for the existence of God. Hold on, let me find it so I don't butcher the. Where is it? Goes something to the effect that there's no purely rational argument for the existence of God, or for theism. There's only a theistic account of rationality. And when I heard that, I was like, oh, that's perfect. And then I really started kind of trying to get into the psychology of the other. Like, what's going on? Why is this so difficult? Because once you get it, right? Once you get tag,
Hmm.
don't you feel that it's like, this is so obvious? Like, in fact, there's nothing more obvious.
Yeah, it's almost like a hidden in plain sight type of thing. Like this is should have been obvious the whole time.
So let me give you another conversation that I had that kind of illustrates the same point. I was talking with my chair of philosophy. Really great guy. He graduated from Thomas Aquinas College, like myself. Of course, he's older, but so I stopped by his office maybe like a month ago to ask him a question, if because I was dealing with arguing with some people about nominalism, and they said, "Well, I'm just kind of interested in what his thoughts were." I said, "Do you have any good arguments against nominalism?" And he says, "Well, what do you mean?" And I said, "Well, that nominalism's false." And he says, "Well, isn't it obvious?" And I'm like, "Yeah, it's like the story of my life." I'm sitting here. The hardest problem is arguing, like, isn't it obvious? The hardest problem is convincing people the problem isn't hard at all, but simple. And I really, it's kind of the frustrating part about philosophy. And it illustrates too that what's really going on is not an intellectual issue.
Yeah.
It's a spiritual issue that people want to attempt to kind of justify their idols, as they put out talk about in the paper. And so, and St. Paul talks about this too. All men know that God exists, but they suppress that knowledge. And so there's different ways you can suppress that, but the philosophers build systems, don't they? And they make it super complicated, and they're really smart. And then it puts the burden on us, that it's like, well, now I've got to learn all this stuff. I've got to learn logic, modal logic, and all this analytic philosophy and epistemology, just to cut through all the BS and show you that the problem's not hard at all, but simple, and that's the hardest problem. Would you agree?
Yeah, I mean, there's this illusion that's cast that makes people think that it's all very, profound and deep and sophisticated. And really, the only sophisticated part is when we're addressing this supposed sophisticated arguments of the opponents, but are really just kind of like, smoke and mirrors to cover up total bankruptcy and absolutely no foundations for anything.
And I'm not even sure that most people are aware that they're doing this. And we also talked about too is that once these systems are constructed for you, and I'm talking about the systems because we're going to get into the paper of and what I mean by autonomous epistemology, but it's system building. Once these systems are kind of built, you're brought up in that, right? And a good way to kind of think about it is, or you adopt it, you work within it. It's an operating system. And they're operating systems that can make you dumb. I had one of the, interesting enough, he was a Jesuit priest, but that was one of my master's advisors. And he would always criticize different like schools of thought, like Marxism. And he was like, oh, it's stupid. He's like, but it's sort of stupid that you have to go to school to learn.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a stupidity that only intellectuals could believe.
That's right. So we have this kind of naive view that it's like, well, the enlightened you see there in college, and that's there's the stupid and then there's the educated, and it's like, no, you go to school to educate yourself in stupidity. And so part of the problem is not being able to see the obvious. Is that, and we've talked about this too. You've got yourself into a bad program and a bad operating system that doesn't allow you to see kind of clearly and think through stuff. So, the natural theologian et al. Think that, well, we just give people arguments and they'll just see it. But the problem isn't an argument. How are you going to see the proof or the argument when your operating system doesn't allow you to? So
and you also have an inner partial motivation to suppress that truth, right? This is that point about virtue epistemology, virtue knowledge, or virtue ethics that is often ignored by the natural theology proponents, which is ironic because I've asked a lot of them if they think that a person who is an unbeliever and prefers vice, would that in any way maybe affect the evidences that they see and how they interpret the evidences? And most of them will say yes. But then when you really drill down into their approach, they're still acting like, but all I have to do is like pile up evidences and eventually they'll kind of tip over and convince the person to maybe believe.
Now, all that being said, it doesn't prevent me from trying to figure out better ways, again, kind of in the spirit of Russ Mannion, of cutting through all of that. And one of the ways that motivated this paper was, if I was the other person, how would I be seeing this? I mean, it's really hard to kind of do to get yourself out of your own paradigm and think in terms of the other person so that I can come back into the paradigm and then work some of that into my paper. So one of the things that I did was just kind of put an ad out on all the like socials. Give me your best objections. Like, let me see it from your point of view so that I can go back and kind of think through, like, what is it that people are struggling with? How can I answer it? And then again, how to boil down a lot of this really kind of complicated stuff and make it a lot more presentable. So hopefully, I have different kind of reactions to the paper. Obviously, some people are really confused. I see that and when we get into this, second and first order statements and knowledge, that people get really confused about that. And I think one of the difficult things about this too is, I was just talking to my brother on the phone, and he was like, I just found out that like over 50% of people don't have an inner monologue. And I'm like, oh, go tell him I already did it.
Yeah, I just did a stream on that too the other day.
And that this kind of inability, this cognitive inability, and would also relate to, I think, kind of paradigm analysis. So we've talked about this. Well, this is the way you think, right? So I find that people have it really difficult kind of stepping out at kind of higher meta levels to kind of ask kind of meta epistemological questions. And there's something tied to kind of introspection, I think, because introspection kind of questions and doubts our own thoughts, right? I mean, when I introspect,
would an example be something for the audience, something simple like if I said the dog is brown, right? That would be a basic knowledge claim. If I said I have knowledge that the dog is brown, would be a higher level order of questioning.
Yes. And a lot of people get this confused too about what we're arguing. I've never actually posited that an atheist or anybody else who doesn't embrace the Orthodox worldview can't have knowledge. I think it's possible. But to state that you have knowledge, to claim that you do, or to know that I'm in a state of knowledge and I know the dog's there, that's a second order.
Yeah, the first time I came to one of those conferences in Texas with you, there was a bit of a disagreement with an individual over this very question where he thought that I was saying that an unbeliever literally has no knowledge when the point was that they can't justify the knowledge that they have, but they know things. They just don't have an account for the knowledge.
Yeah. And again, because Orthodox provides, as we'll see through the theonomous epistemology of revelatory theism and epistemically privileged position, we can actually say, of course, the atheist knows. Remember, we discussed this too, and I'm trying to remember if it was Stanley Loy. I think it was, that said, Orthodoxy is not married to any particular philosophy. It's not wedded. It's not like Thomism wedded to Aristotelianism. Why? Because it transcends all these man-made systems.
Yeah, there's a great...
Therefore, has an epistemic kind of privileged position to look and be like, sure, Plato got some stuff right here.
There's a Florovsky essay, I think, that's really good, where he talks about how the patristic era didn't just adopt Plato or adopt Aristotle, that they would pull from any of these, and the terminology and the ideas are really revelatory in the sense of the nature person distinction, for example, is not in Aristotle. It's a unique revelation to the Christian position, even though it might utilize terminology from Aristotle or Plato. The meanings, the phronema behind the terms that are used is intended to be revelatory, revelation, not just sort of one-to-one Greek, cribbing from Greek philosophy.
So I'm trying to set up like the kind of whole prolegomena to my paper. And I've explained what the motivation was, why this is kind of a different style. That I was trying to also get the objections and then answer and kind of think through these things and articulate it, which I was, of course I didn't get all the objections, but I thought kind of the more serious or more common objections. And the other thing too, if you remember, I had this phone call with you. That first and second order argument that I developed in there came to me in a dream. It wasn't a fever dream. And I remember in the dream, I was arguing with this atheist because I don't know what your dreams are like, but this is all I do in my...
Are you being serious or joking? Did you really have a dream about this or not?
I'm absolutely serious. I was debating this atheist in my dream, and I developed this argument. And I remember thinking in the dream, I'm like, I think I'm onto something here. Now, I've had all those kinds of thoughts and dreams before, and they're totally nonsensical, right? When you wake up, oftentimes you're like, what was I thinking? That didn't make any sense. But in this dream, I thought about, I think I'm on, you got to remember this and pull it outside of your dream and write it into your paper. And I just kept reminding myself that. I'm like, pull this out. Don't forget, because it's easy to forget something from a dream. And of course, I wake up and I forget. And I'm driving down to liturgy with my sub deacon, and I'm telling him, I'm like, I think I just stumbled upon this really cool argument, and I can't remember it. After the liturgy, after partaking of the Eucharist, I remembered it. And I'm like, I got it. And I tell my sub deacon, and he was just like, probably thought I was like super nerdy. And I'm like, so if you remember, I called you because I don't know, like, this is part of my introspection. I'm like, what if this is totally nonsense? And I think, oh, this is so great. I got it from a dream, and this totally makes sense. So I'd called you and some other people, and I told you about this argument between this kind of circularity between first and second order knowledge in terms of autonomous epistemology. And both you and other people said, I think it's a really good argument. And so that I kind of put it in there and refined it in the paper. So that was another motivation behind the paper too, which is really interesting.
All right, so let's get into the paper. Like, what's so you lay out the introductory paragraph where you're talking about how you want to present a theonomous epistemology or revelatory theism account for knowledge versus autonomous epistemology, utilizing this first order, second order tiered approach. And then you argue that the giving account for second order statements in terms of the existence of knowledge reveals a unique epistemic problem that requires a justification for the second order. And then the conclusion is that of your argument is that only really theism is capable of grounding a solution or giving a solution to the necessary conditions for the possibility of knowledge.
Yeah. So what I want to do, there's two things that I did in this paper is to put in to a true disjunct. And what that means is, and a bunch of Malpass's asses, I call them, his acolyte asses, that kind of pseudo intellectuals that just kind of parrot these arguments that they get from Malpass. And I put this in my paper. They were presenting an argument from Malpass that basically, when I present the Orthodox version of tag, and one of the arguments that I use to kind of pedagogically illustrate what's kind of behind all of this is the disjunctive argument. And so Malpass had this argument that, either it's not a true disjunct, meaning there could be other options. Like, for example, you're eating a peanut butter and jelly sandwich or a steak. Well, that means a true disjunct. It's not either A or B, but A or not A. And then we'll get into this later. They have their own criticism of that. But I really do want to put it into a true dichotomy within the disjunct. And so it's going to be either autonomous or theonomous. There can't be any third option. And then what I do is I take the autonomous project and I look, okay, what is epistemically, more than just epistemically problematic, but devastating, self-refuting. And in this section, I think I had titled it The Failure of Autonomous Epistemology. There's two main arguments that I develop in here. That's the putting your epistemological horse before your metaphysical cart argument, which you know that I'd already kind of developed that before writing the paper. And then the first and second order, which I had kind of a version of that, but I actually did something, I refined it and did something different here. Partly in base two, not only on my dream, but objections that I heard that where people thought that I was simply just kind of rehashing the Chisholm problem. And so I had to kind of make it more clear that it's like, it's similar, in so far as a dialectical kind of tension. And and circularity, but it's fundamentally different. So that no answers to Chisholm's criterion problem are going to transfer over and answer the argument that I'm making. But just let me restate, those are the two main arguments of the failure of the autonomous epistemology: putting your epistemic horse before your metaphysical cart, and the circularity epistemic bootstrapping that arises from the dialectical tension between the first and second order knowledge. And we can go over those, but if you want.
Well, one question before that is why are you saying a dialectical tension between first and second order?
Excuse me, I meant the dialectical tension was between the metaphysics and epistemology. I guess the first.
Yeah, I'm not calling it into question. I'm just, could you flesh that out for me and the audience?
So the dialectical tension between, and I guess there is a dialectical tension between the first and second, and it's something similar to the epistemological category and metaphysical, right? So dia two, right? I have two categories. And with the epistemological metaphysical, again, the metaphysics, we would say the way the universe is in the ontology determines what, if we know anything at all, and how. But then I have all these different metaphysical accounts. So then what I have to do is what's contingent upon metaphysics has to be placed prior to metaphysics so that I can actually determine, i.e. know before I could even know, what metaphysical account is, so that I can then justify my epistemology. So what I'm doing is an unjustified move. I'm going, well, let's just pretend that's not the case, and let's put this over here and just remember what I always say: grant me all my assumptions so that I can then pretend to justify my epistemology. Physics. So what we see is I can't get to this without this, but I have to put this to figure out this, right? So there's two things that are kind of in tension that can't kind of resolve each other. They both seem to kind of be dependent on each other, but because they're divided and in this kind of dialectical tension, I can't actually solve the problem or accomplish a task that I set out to actually do in any of the philosophy or epistemology that I'm trying to do. Likewise, with the first and second order, I have what? Two categories. With the first order, John knows the dog's brown, right? And then our claims that John knows that the dog is brown, or that knowledge exists. Now, clearly, I couldn't make the second order claim unless the first order were true. But what's the problem? I'm always making second order claims about the first. So it's, well, yeah, obviously I've got to provide justification. So what? Grant me all my assumptions, i.e. about first order, so that I can make all my statements about my second order, that John knows knowledge exists. Basically, everything everybody would ever put in a chat, all the objections that we're getting are all second order. They're all making epistemic claims, which is different than a person being in the state of knowledge, is very different than somebody actually making claims. So again, we have this kind of tension between two categories. I can't get number two without number one, but I'm always in number two. So I assume and bootstrap unjustifiably so category one to arbitrarily and unjustifiably try to justify.
And that's similar to the criterion problem move, right?
It's similar to, yeah. But it's not identical, because in the criterion problem, people will be like, well, you start off with a methodology and blah, blah, blah. But this is more of a fundamental problem. once you grasp the circularity, the vicious circularity and dialectical tension between the first and second order, and realize I'm always in second order from an autonomous position, starting point. I can never get to one.
And so, thus,
I have to get to one in order to establish anything I'm saying at level 2.
Yeah. And so the conditions for the possibility of knowledge are a level 2 type of statement. But they're also a level 1 statement, and so thus the dilemma.
Yeah. So I have this. I tried to put it in just some easy premises. If it's true that knowledge exists, first order, then our beliefs or statements that knowledge exists is also true. Why? Because one is constitutive for 2.
So there's some people in the audience still. Before you go to this, hold on. So people are still kind of wanting to understand. Again, first, we don't get this point, then we're talking past everybody. So again, help me with some examples.
Okay, let's assume a kind of standard with the possibility given get here that there could be a fourth condition, but at least knowledge requires a believer who believes as a true belief that's for the right reasons, i.e. justified. So a true justified belief with the caveat that perhaps there could be a fourth condition or something. All right. So that means, let's say John believes something about an apple. The apple is, there's 2 apples in front of me or something like that. Now he doesn't guess. He actually has a reliable, let's say, mechanism, his faculties, whatever. I'll give it whatever you guys want. Let's say we agree it's possible that John not only has a true belief, but he arrives at it for the right reasons. Okay, anybody can do that, regardless of whether they're an atheist or not. We would say that's possible. Okay, so that would be a first order. John knows there's 2 apples in front of him. Okay? It's different to say, it's a different claim to say that John knows that he knows. John might have knowledge there's 2 apples. This came up when I was an undergraduate. We were doing the Pythagorean proof in Euclid, and a professor asked me almost kind of a second order question. What do you think if a student doesn't actually know the proof, right? Or know that they know? Do you think that they don't know that a squared plus b squared equals c squared? So what I would say now is that, well, if they came to the belief that a squared, basically the area on the sides of a right angled triangle is equal to the area on the hypotenuse for the right reasons, I don't think they would have to know that they know that, as long as they were justified. So again, on all the literature on epistemology, everybody says you could know something without knowing that you know it. Does that make sense? That's the first thing we have to grasp. Knowing something or being in a state of knowledge doesn't mean that you know that you're in a state of knowledge.
Yeah, so basically, imagine, audience, I'm looking at the pen, and it's just, the pen is blue. That's level 1. Then, the higher order thinking is, it's an abstracted higher level way of viewing it. Jay knows that the pen is blue. Is that good?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Because otherwise it would be way too stringent. If we said that knowledge is a sufficient condition for second order knowledge. I mean, it's just obviously not true. I think there's many cases where we admit that people probably know stuff and they don't know why that they know it.
But yeah, as Father Deacon pointed out, like the second statement here, the higher order statement, is also a statement of knowledge, right? But it's a higher order statement of knowledge, and so this is what you're saying. They're sort of reciprocal, right? In that this one might also lead to this one, but this one rests on also being a level 1 type of statement. So the point is that a person who recognizes this is then in a kind of a dilemma, and this is the dilemma that we're pointing out that pretty much all the atheists end up in when encountering tag. They typically respond to tag as if every proposition, every argument, every statement is just a level 1 statement and never addressing the meta or the second order type of reasoning, and thus they never typically get the argument until we really, flesh it out or hash it out after a while. So anyway,
and that's what happened in my dream is that I'm reading through all this literature where it's like, this is first order logic, this is second order logic. In epistemology, this is first order knowledge. John knows there's a blue pen in front of him, and John knowing that he knows there's a blue pen is, they're making all these distinctions. And then in the dream, it dawned on me that I'm like, yeah, but you're talking about, you're making claims about all this stuff. Like, what order do I put that in? And I'm like, that's always second order. Like, you're always at the second level, at the higher level. You're making claims about knowledge, about John, about first order. And then in my dream, it started around, I'm like, I don't think you can ever get out of the second order. We're always at this kind of meta level, making claims about assuming what we want to prove, that knowledge exists. Because I could only make those claims if knowledge actually exists, which is the heart of the paper and the heart of the matter, right? How do we determine, how do we know that knowledge exists? And let's just run through in our heads right now.
And again, that's not a level 1 statement. I mean, or it is a level 1 statement, but it's also it's a both and. It's a level 1 and a level 2 statement, right? That that knowledge exists.
I would say it's a level 2. It's a second order. That's my point.
Yeah.
About the first order.
Well, but you were making the point that every second order statement is also a first order statement, right? At the same time.
No, that's not. The argument is all of our statements are second order, and concerning epistemology, they're second order about the first order. But I can't have my second order be true or justified unless my first order is true.
That's what I mean to say.
So how do I? So here's the question to everybody in the audience and every atheist: how do I justify first order claims? I mean, first order knowledge. In other words, how do I justify that knowledge exists or reason? And what are, like, let's go over what were the possible answers people could give.
Well, and I'm not trying to be obtuse, but I'm trying to understand, because how is it not the case that the second order statement isn't also a knowledge claim, isn't it?
Yes, so that's the whole point.
Right.
It's a knowledge claim only, and can only be true if knowledge exists. So it gets us back to number 1. How do we know knowledge exists? And guess what they're going to say? Well, if knowledge exists, then knowledge exists, right?
I know, understand, but isn't the second order statement also still just a knowledge claim?
Yes.
But it's a knowledge claim about it's self-referential about the subject itself and its having of the knowledge. Okay, but it's still a knowledge claim.
Subject. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. The content and subject's not different. It's in both cases, first order and second order, the content subject's the same. It's knowledge.
Yes.
So somebody had brought up an objection that, Well, I don't need to justify the two because it's the same content, the second order because it's the same content.
Right.
But I'm like, you're missing the point entirely. My question's about how do we justify number one? I know it's the same content. We're talking about the same subject, knowledge. I'm trying to figure out how from autonomous reasoning you're ever going to be able to establish without vicious circularity or bootstrapping that knowledge exists. Especially when you're always assuming what you want to prove. So basically, second order statements are that. Well, I'm making a knowledge claim, and I'm assuming that knowledge exists because I'm talking about it.
That's what I was getting at. Yeah, that's what I meant. So in other words, it's not answering the question to say that, well, it's a higher order statement, but it's still just a claim about, the subject of knowledge or the subject in the sense of the agent having the knowledge. So, but that doesn't get you to justification, is your point. That's just kicking the can down the road.
Exactly. And somebody said, well, because it's the same content,
right?
Second order statements don't need a different sort of justification. And I grant that. I'd be like, that's fine. I'm just looking for a justification for knowledge. So what they don't realize is this was a really sophisticated kind of epistemological way of basically saying what we always say. Just grant me all my assumptions so I can make my case and prove to you that my made-up story is true.
Okay, so I have a question here, and this is something I don't understand. So are you saying that there's this inherent problem in epistemology just from first and second order statements about justification? Or are you saying that tag is like this move from 1 to 2?
I'm saying epistemology has the problem that's illustrated between 1 and 2 that nobody seems.
Okay, but so you're not likening the transcendental categories, the possibility of knowledge, to the level 2? I thought that's what you were doing.
Oh, that certainly is. So, for example, because the orthodox tag admits the possibility that people can have first order knowledge without presupposing God.
Right. We agree.
Then the question is, how do you ground or account it? What worldviews or possible positions could actually account or justify that knowledge exists? Now that's a second order. And what I'm going to show in this paper is that, tag's dealing with the second order. So because it's admitting, sure, you can know stuff, but you can never actually, from your position, make a statement, an epistemic statement, to claim that knowledge exists or that you're in a state of knowledge. Why? Because you'll assume the exact thing that you want to prove. So put in the dichotomy, then we see one who's in a radically different kind of category, because what I started thinking through is like, well, why is this even happening? Why is it that autonomous man can't get out of this epistemic quagmire? And again, the very notion of dialectical tension seems to be something to do with finitude, right? Finite means bounded. And so you have these categories that are kind of bounded.
I would say it deals more so with the fall rather than natural nature and finitude, because the way Maximus talks about I wouldn't say there's any dialectical tension that's natural or in terms of the world.
You're probably right, because
it's just a result of the fall.
You have division. In fact, you have division in time. This is where you get chronology.
I would have to disagree there, but we don't have to go into that. But that's a whole other metaphysical topic. But do you think that there's a question here, and then
I don't mean kind of like absolute unity or anything like this, but this kind of thing where things are broken and they're not tied together. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, dialectical tension as a result of the fall is the result of the way things are structured now in terms of all of the problems in the world are a result of the fall, but they're not anything to do with like nature. They're the corruption of nature. Anyway, there's a question that is.
But I still think there's something to do with that, both the fall and probably the finitude, so that if you took finite categories, you can't absolutize them, right? Why? Because they're created. They're not all encompassing. In other words, none of the things that we take, right, all of which may be true, good, and beautiful, we can't take those, the created things, and absolutize them, which is basically what philosophy is actually doing, right? It's taking something good, just like every heresy, something true, and it's taken out of its proper context, right? And it's elevating this to the level of being an absolute rather than something that's contingent upon. And I think this is the problem of why these problems can't be resolved.
Yeah, but time is a creation, so I just wouldn't locate dialectical tensions within time or the created order itself. It's a result of the fall, because time is there's the aeon, which is the eternal, timeless creation of God. So time itself is good, and it's, as Stanislaus says, taken up into the divine. I just wouldn't equate that with anything to do with dialectics, because
I was just thinking about, and it's a total different topic. I was actually thinking about chronos, not aeon or kairos, like possibly could be a product of the fall.
I don't think so.
We noticed that chronological times being lifted up and healed. For some,
but that's because of it's not time itself that's fallen. Like the fall didn't put us into time.
There's something specifically about chronology that might be fallen, but not time itself. Yeah, I don't think time itself.
Well, this is a different discussion. I don't mean to get off track, but there is a great question by a person in the audience I would like you to address. Yes. Roderick says, "Is what you're saying, Father Deacon, germane to the discussion with Malpass, where Malpass objected to necessary preconditions of intelligibility by saying that he lacks a belief in them, yet his sense of intelligibility is still held?"
Well, I think this is why the first and second order comes in. Because one of the things that I noticed that atheists were saying was, well, I don't have a worldview. Have you noticed this? Atheism is not a position.
Yeah, they'll oftentimes say, oh, I have actually no position, and that allows them to sort of slip and slide into different positions.
And so what I realized, I'm like, well, those are second order claims about your position, right? Like you never get out of the problem. You just move it up to a higher order.
Well, yeah, this guy says his next statement is a Malpass perhaps conflating whether or not he assents to a proposition with it being true or not, right? Like a kind of fallacy of incredulity, like, well, I just don't see how it could be, so, I don't believe in it, so.
Yeah, exactly. But again, there's no way out of it in two senses. I point this out in my paper. There's nobody that's positionless, right? Or presuppositionless. So we can just move it up to higher orders. You're making a whole bunch of epistemic claims about that you're understanding my paper, you're understanding what the argument is, that you're understanding what your agnostic position, that I'm not taking a position, all the various things that even go into that, right? I mean, it's almost kind of reminiscent of like Descartes, right? Where they think they actually get to this kind of foundational, like, well, I can make this agnostic claim, and you see this doesn't depend on making any other commitments to anything. It's like, all you have to show them is that it's like, that's impossible. Like the cogito assumes a whole host of different things. So I'd say there's a similarity there, that with this kind of incredulity agnostic position, right? They don't get out of the problem, because it's like, well, yeah, but you just You have a whole host of epistemic presuppositions and commitments. Just even with that.
Yeah, it's almost just a way of it's like another way of saying I choose not to address this problem, and so it's not there, basically.
Yeah. Second of all, it doesn't matter, because as soon as I put it into the dialectical tension, if you don't assume the necessary condition for the possibility of knowledge, and it's truly put into the disjunct between, if you don't accept purposeful intentionalism, theistic revelation, if you don't accept that, then whether you assent to atheism or accidentalism, or saying it's possible, because notice that's the way that I define autonomous epistemology. Autonomous epistemology is the Thomistic system too. Why? Even though he believes in God, and then ultimately God grounds everything, including knowledge, does Aquinas not start with the assumption that it's possible to account for reasoning, deduction, inferences, even if God might not exist? And then it just turns out we find out he exists later.
No, there's an element of irrationality in the Thomistic scheme, for sure. Which is ironic, because it's a highly rational scheme.
That's what natural theology is. What the mind, by the natural light of reason, can know apart from divine revelation, which is insane. It's totally blasphemous from our position. So anyways, regardless of whether you're an atheist or not, if you do not assent, because it's in the radical disjunct, it's almost kind of like Pascal's wager, right? In the sense that you must wager. To not wager is to wager, right? The radical disjunct is actually like that. If you even think that's a possibility, which is what agnosticism would suggest, you're an accidentalism.
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter what Malpass's arguments are. He's in the accidentalism, and accidentalism is a defeater for the possibility of knowledge.
Hold on. And I agree that accidentalism destroys the possibility of knowledge. But there is a question by Colby who says, Father Deacon, it appears that you are presupposing the thing that you want to demonstrate. You're positing that there's a realist account for knowledge, realist towards knowledge, he says. But the atheist or the pragmatist does not grant any kind of realist position. I assume he means realism in the sense of...
essences?
No, I think he means like in the sense of like... I just went blank. On the account of objects external to you, in terms of ontology, like you're really not necessarily essences, but there's real objects that you're apprehending through your sense data. Colby, do you want to qualify in what's, because realist is used in different senses in the history of philosophy, so you want to qualify in what sense you're using it? Go ahead. A realist account of like indirect realism and direct realism in the sense of Enlightenment debates is, I think, what he's talking about.
I don't think so. I think I get what he's saying. Why? Because this is a more fundamental... That's getting into the kind of details. I feel like I'm the CIA dude.
So let me ask Colby. Colby, do you mean realism in the sense of essences being real ontological metaphysical things, or do you mean realism in the sense of the Enlightenment debate about whether we apprehend things directly or indirectly in the external world?
So I see what he's saying. He's ascribing ontology to knowledge. The atheist defines knowledge simply as a system of thoughts that... Yeah, well, first of all, that doesn't make any sense. We're all saying that knowledge is a property of the mind, right? So
in other words, you could make the same arguments with a metaphysically quiet approach, right? Like your approach here is not necessitating an epistemology.
Why? Because this is prior to any of the details of those kinds of
conversations.
So it doesn't assume any of this.
This is a great point we got to address, and I thank you for pointing that out, Father Deacon, which is, this was your point you made earlier, and we got sidetracked. I apologize for that. That was probably my fault. You made the point that what we're addressing here is the Enlightenment objection to metaphysics, which is that you can't put your metaphysical cart before your epistemic horse. And that's what Father Deacon's pointing out. So Father Deacon's argument is not relying on any grandiose metaphysics. He's actually critiquing the ancient and medieval idea, like natural theology and Aquinas has, that metaphysics is somehow self-evident and epistemology is secondary to that. No, rather, we're agreeing and saying, yes, how do you know that you know before you start telling me about all these metaphysical claims?
Yeah, exactly. And in fact, the way that I usually do my arguments is I take whatever definition of knowledge and justification you want. Why? Because it's such a general and what's the term I want? These are such general and more fundamental questions. They precede the kind of more detailed questions about like how to cash all this stuff out. So all of these arguments are actually designed I'll give you everything you want as far as what you think knowledge is, how that works. It doesn't really matter because issues and problems about the way that how we would justify that. Whatever you think knowledge is.
Yeah. So this is this is an argument about arguments. It's an argument about reason itself. Is it even possible? And that's why it's prior to any first order claim about what exists, what doesn't exist, what's out there, what's not out there. Do I know this? Do I know that?
No redefining it to any ad hoc redefining is going to escape the problem. And that's one of the things I noticed with all the objections is they were saying, well, the atheist isn't going to do that. Well, we'll just sue. And there were all these kind of ad hoc redefining.
Now, I'm assuming you're going to say that the ad hoc redefinings don't work because they're missing the very point, which is that that's just another type of knowledge claim. And what's in question is the possibility of knowledge, right?
Yes. So really easy if I just say, I'll grant you whatever you think knowledge is. The issue still stands. You redefine it however you want. The issue is so fundamental and prior to all of that it doesn't really matter. Then there's no kind of way out of it. And I think that's one of the issues too that I noticed, and I put in the final section of the paper, missing the epistemological forest for the epistemic trees. That I'm like, why are these people getting so bogged down on? Be like, that's not a true disjunctive. Well, that's not how knowledge. What if they just define it this way? And I'm like, what's going on here? Like, why are they saying this? And I realized they're looking at the details and they don't see the bigger question, that the kind of meta question that's being asked.
Exactly.
Let's see.
This is one of the great points of Kant. I mean, I have a lot of disagreements with Kant, but one of the great points of Kant is to really go into kind of the possibilities of philosophy with transcendental categories. And you had it kind of posited in Aristotle's categories, what the categories are. And I disagree with Kant's move to ultimately make them not metaphysical. But regardless of all that, what he's doing, the types of thinking that he's doing about these types of arguments really are revolutionary, and they're worthy of note. And so people that do understand like the Kantian, not the Kantian system, but the type of questions Kant is asking with what he proposes with a transcendental category. And again, we're not saying that we agree with the Kantian position that they're all psychologized or they're all just in the mind or whatever. We're setting that question aside. So let's say we don't have any metaphysical commitments. We're just taking the type of argument that a transcendental argument is about the possibilities or the preconditions for knowledge. And we're saying that is very useful here because it shows us that any knowledge claim that an atheist might have, the very first move they make is assuming that knowledge is possible. That's why the question is prior to the doing of any argument or logic at all.
I just don't understand why this guy Colby the Great thinks I'm assuming the type of I haven't assumed anything. I've literally given everything over to the atheists.
Yeah, we could say that. Let's say there is no metaphysics that's knowable at all. Let's just grant that there's no realism at all, no essences, no essentialism at all. The question that then is, what is the account for knowing? How is knowledge possible? Right?
I just brought up the metaphysical and the epistemological tension because there are people that would admit, and I still think that the pragmatist gives a metaphysical. I don't think there's any kind of way out of making metaphysical claims. Even if you think you're a metaphysical quietist, I'm just showing that those who accept that would have this problem. Now, the first and second order issue has nothing to do with the dialectical tension between metaphysics and epistemology. So any one of those are sufficient to basically show the flaw of, I was just developing two sufficient arguments together. And I wasn't making any metaphysical claims about or assuming or anything like that. I was just basically taking other people's positions and being like, you admit, and this is what people always get wrong about tag is, oh, so I have to just arbitrarily just assume all of your presuppositions in order for knowledge to work. No, that's not what we said. I take as far as the impossibility of the contrary, and I show that people on their own grounds are engaged in performative contradictions and things that you yourself, the rules that you arbitrarily establish, you say, I require this, and then you do just the opposite. So it's not my my arbitrary rules of the game here, and if it's like on your own account, you violate your own principles. Like your system doesn't do what you want it to do. And guess what? On your own admittance, orthodoxy does everything that you want your paradigm or epistemology, philosophy, or religion to do, but it doesn't do. And I find that people really get that confused.
Yeah, I mean that's misunderstanding that even though what we're talking about focuses on a couple examples, it's still a comparison of paradigms, right? If we're going to compare paradigms, we still have to pick something within the paradigms, right? The Orthodox paradigm, you have an atheist paradigm. The argument is just simply pointing out that it doesn't matter which thing we pick. Like if you have a belief in, if you believe that you have true knowledge about some object or whatever, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter which object or thing we choose within the worldviews. The question that Father Deacon is raising is always automatically there because this is a question prior to any knowledge claim. And they seem to have a really hard problem grasping that. Yes. Because they think they think that when you say it's a higher order type of argument, they assume that means you're importing a bunch of metaphysical baggage to this. Oh, you're trying to say that the higher order is like universals and like no. It doesn't matter what you think about metaphysics or what I think about metaphysics. Is like this is prior to any of those types of claims. That's what they have a really hard time accepting. So I'm going to pick up
real quick because this illustrates it too. So what was the gentleman we were just referring to? Colby the Great. I've heard this a million times. Well, the nominalists will just say this, or the atheists won't accept, right? They'll say this. And so your argument doesn't work. And what they're missing the epistemologic forest for the epistemic trees. Guess what? Those are second order claims about pragmatism, about how they're defining truth and falsity and stuff like that. So it doesn't matter. It's irrelevant to the question of how do you justify that? How would we possibly justify that the pragmatist is justified in that move to actually say that? And I don't know why, like, to me, it seems, like I said, the hardest problem is convincing people the problem's not hard at all, but simple. To me, that seems really simple. You're making a bunch of epistemic claims about what counts as knowledge, how they'll redefine it, and I want to know how you justify that. And nobody can seem to like pick up on like what that question even is and like why that's so detrimental. Well, you see, what eventually is going to happen is they're going to say, well, grant me my assumptions about pragmatism that I can actually redefine knowledge and all this stuff. And then that's what would justify my position. So that's exactly what I'm trying to show in all these arguments, is that you're epistemically bootstrapping. You have no justification for your justification criteria.
Yeah, so let's look at this on a diagram, and this illustrates what you're talking about. The tree is green. Bob knows the tree is green. First order, second order. The atheist response, like Father Deacon says, is almost always, well, a pragmatist will just say this, and then interject whatever the pragmatist's account is. Oh, well, a relativist would just say this. Oh, well, an epistemic nihilist would just say this. Oh, materialist would just say this. These answers are missing what the argument actually is, because none of this is addressing what the challenge is. It doesn't matter what all types of things you try to put in there, because every time you try to make a knowledge claim with one of these failed systems, pragmatist, relativist, nihilist, materialist, it's not going to give an account for how you ground the knowledge. That's the point.
Then watch what they'll do. They'll say that they think this is objection because it's the burden of proof game, right? Well, you're saying they're wrong, so you're going to have to prove that those are all wrong. Well, wait a minute. On what terms? If we haven't even been able to get a justification for proof itself, do you see what the issue is? Like, whose proofs do we use?
Yeah, just saying that, well, you can't answer a pragmatist has an account of this. That's not showing that is a justification for knowledge.
Do you know what it reminds me of? You know these weirdo creepers that you get calling on your Twitter space and stuff like that? And they start telling these like long, weird, elaborate
wild stories about, dude, you don't understand, man, back in like 5000 BC, the Mesopotamians were visited by a space force of aliens that set up
and they tell this whole story, and you see what the Tower of Babel really was gematria, confusing the people.
Yeah,
and
right.
That's why we have to actually, any word that sounds like another word really is that word. It's not a genetic fallacy that was created. The genetic fallacy was a fallacy created by the elites trying to, right? They have this whole story, right? And you're like, that's great, wonderful storyteller. I want to know if it's true and how we determine. Isn't this exactly the question that Plato says? I'm not concerned with doxa. I want episteme.
So yeah, belief versus knowledge, right? Or opinion versus knowledge.
And so all that's happening is with a pragmatist. I'm like, congratulations. Pragmatist wrote a non-fictional pragmatist story. It never gets into the category. I'm still wondering, like,
right? Telling a story isn't what it means to give justification,
and that's not an objection, right? Well, what if it's possible that that's true? Like, again, even that is already assuming epistemic categories.
Yeah. So suddenly the atheists are like these creative writers where everything's possible, right? If you're a theist, nothing is possible. But suddenly, like, when this question comes up, anything's possible. We live in a universe. We're like metaverse, multiverse. We're like, there's a universe where there's dragons, and I'm the king of it. And it's like everything. So it's like suddenly everything is possible, even though like 99% of the time when the atheist is arguing, there's nothing that's possible except for material causation, right? Like cause and effect, like in a determined scheme.
And then they think they get out of this, but it's like you're making second higher order claims about possibility and about sentences and all this stuff. That's why I'm like, I can't get them to realize they're committing and presupposing stuff that are unjustified before they provide any justification for that. So if you remember, that guy Amdir came on to your stream and did the same thing, and then with me, and he had some like idea.
Oh, he was saying something like, well, if it doesn't plug into the equation, like into the modal, structure perfectly, then the whole thing collapses and you can't actually put it into a modal argument.
Well, he was saying that with you, but when he was when I was debating him on Patrick's stream, he had like this kind of Mysterianism, possibly another world.
What is that? I don't know what that is.
It's an ad hoc word that, like everything, it's just like, what
that's a word you made up.
No, he came up with it. Was like mysterious.
Oh, he made this up.
Yeah, he was like, my epistemology is like I'll have to look what exactly he said, but it was like,
I mean, was he using this as like a hypothetical? Like, well, what if I just say my epistemology is Mysteriumism or something?
Yeah, that like, we may not know what the justification is, but it's there, and started going through all these like, well, it's possible that you missed, and if it's logically possible, then your position cannot be that it's necessary. And again, it misses the whole thing, that it's like, now guess what? You're making third order claims about possibility and necessity and logic and all this stuff. And I'm like, I just can't get people to actually see what the actual issue is. And that's the most frustrating thing. It's like, I mean, maybe I could appreciate this being ADD, but it's like, there's a squirrel, right? Hey, look at that over. And it's like, you're just trying to direct people to, it's like, do you not see what I'm saying? I'm like, you're making all these epistemic claims. How are we ever going to justify that? And they get distracted down another route and another route. And it's just like, I can't hone people in to actually see what the problem is. Second issue too with
so in other words, how is any knowledge at all possible is prior to any knowledge claim. And every time you try to answer it, you don't get out of the box because it's a knowledge claim, right?
Too, that
is that right, or am I misconceiving?
Yeah, exactly. The second issue too that we always get with this too is this, well, how do we know? I mean, it could be, or this person could just say like, these are,
it's like, well, there's some other justification in over in China that we don't know about, that philosopher Qing Dong has developed, and you just don't know about it. But so how does your position?
Where's Jim Bob in the chat. We have this guy in Jim Bob's YouTube today basically saying, what if there was an alien race that developed the exact same theology as orthodoxy? I mean, would that serve as a necessary condition? And I was like, well, this is ridiculous. First of all, it's just ad hoc. Number two, conceivability is not a good guide to logical possibility. And number three, part of the orthodox revealed paradigm is the exclusivity of the paradigm. In other words, paradigm A, orthodoxy, says not B. So an alien race creates theology B that's identical to orthodoxy. You know what that means? B and not B.
It would also be obvious that the newer one is totally cribbed from the previous too. So it would be an obvious fraudulent copy. Because we had people in the Discord making this argument like 5 years ago. They would say, well, I believe in the new revelation given to me as a Viking, of a Viking trinity that does all the same grounding and justification of your trinity, except it's my Viking. And I'm like, but that would not be the historic Christian church.
Yes.
And so evidentialism would come into play here as well.
So that goes back to my...
Excuse me, evidences would come into play, not evidentialism. Excuse me.
Yes, that's right. So anyways, this goes back to the disjunctive, is that, well, obviously, what is it that they're doing when they're like, well, I'm thinking of a possibility. I mean, what if there's this other religion that revealed... What they're doing is system building.
Yeah, it's like it's the same. It's the same thing when JF said, What if there is a planet I can conceive of where there's a robot and no people, and the robot runs the planet? And it's like suddenly creative writing is cool, and any kind of metaphysics goes, right? Which again, the Christian, no metaphysics for you. However, when I do my creative writing hypotheticals, I get to imagine all possibilities.
So they're missing again the epistemological forest. For the epistemological trees, because guess what they're doing? They don't realize the radical disjunct. That's autonomous epistemology, and the only other option is theonomous. So all of your hypotheticals, all your objections will always fit into autonomous epistemology because it's not revealed.
I think they're just going to, go ahead.
As soon as I show the failure of autonomous epistemology, and it will always fail, that's why there are no objections.
Well, at this point, they're just going to say, well, that doesn't mean that yours is revealed. That's your claim. You just have another elaborately built system. And you engaged in a system building project through the system of Christianity over many centuries and millennia. And so your system building, and you're not doing anything different than I am. It's just that mine's more updated with science code or something.
Science. Mine was revealed by science. Well, that's why I put a footnote in there. I'm like, well, let's just look at what the ones that are claimed to be revealed. Because that's the next one, right? Is that, well, how does tag prove to the Orthodox God? I'm like, all right, so if we move past it couldn't be system building autonomous epistemology, but I've got all these other competitors of religions that are claiming to be revealed. I'm like, we could look at those. How many are there? 6, 7, 8 religions that claim to be revealed from God. And remember, this is part of the objection too, that, well, there could be an infinite amount of, possibilities that you have to eliminate. Well, first we could show that most worldviews boil down to a few options. Ultimately, with this paper I do is that it boils down between accidentalism and intentionalism.
Yeah, this is a great example of something it boiled down to.
Or theonomous or autonomous. So let's look at the theonomous and autonomous. Okay, so there's a few more options to consider. Talmudic Judaism, Islam. I don't think Buddhism claims to have special revelation, right? Like it's not
revealed. To my knowledge, no.
Hinduism, yes. Mormonism. I mean, really, guys, how many you think there are? 10? And then we can go through and then look at their paradigms, right? And if they have principles that are would make knowledge impossible, we can eliminate those. So again, even on other people's grounds, like their kind of litmus tests and their standards, we'd say we fulfill it. We're not creating our own, hey, in our own game, we have this, but you don't have it. We'd say everything that you want, we just fulfilled, and your system, none of these systems can do. And what is that? Well, you certainly want to have historical continuity, right? That's kind of fits the, like, your paradigm or theory should describe reality, right? You come up with some physics theory that like doesn't describe anything. So as it matches historical continuity. It has descriptive power, right? It's describing. It's not only lacks contradictions, but is coherent. What does that mean? That means that, for example, I could hold two different true propositions that have nothing logically connected with each other. The tree is green and the apple and the mic's working or something like that. Okay, they're not contradictory, but I can't derive or infer from one to the other. Now, what's really nice about when we talk about a coherence, right? We're not just talking about propositions don't contradict each other. We're saying they cohere together, that there's inferences from one to the other. So I could list all these kind of attributes that, yes, from your paradigm, you want all this and you can't pull it off. Orthodoxy does claim to be a revealed religion, and it can pull it off by your own standards. Where are you going to go? Like, what better proof do you want? do you know what I mean?
Yeah, the next thing I would ask is, could you flesh out a little more about the contrast between like a teleological worldview and a disteleological worldview, or theism versus accidentalism, and how this is a great way to kind of suss out a large portion of worldviews with one question, and a couple other fundamental types of questions like this would also cancel out a lot of worldviews, like, is knowledge objective or relative? I mean, there's if you put together a few disjunctives, you could pretty quickly cancel out most worldviews.
It's not hard at all. So one of the things I want to qualify, and I qualified in my footnote, when I use the word intentionality, I realized when I was arguing with Amdir, they were taking the technical philosophical sense of intentionality in philosophy of mind and philosophy of language is our propositions or mental states are about or directed towards something.
No, you mean it in the sense of will and telos, correct?
Intention, yeah, and more kind of a common colloquial sense of so
well, hold on, course, just real quick. So the reason I'm saying that is that oftentimes the argument about, I mean, you put God purposefully and intentionally creates the world. So, there's a book about this that it's an Oxford Press book. The name of it escapes me, but basically it's arguing that there's only two options on this, and you might come up with a third where there's maybe some mix between a God who creates a world with purpose, purposiveness, intentionality, telos, versus a world that has no direction, no guidance, no end, no purposiveness, or a disteleological universe. But to be clear, the only reason I'm bringing this up is that when we start saying this, they'll immediately say, "Oh, you're making the teleological argument." It's not the teleological argument.
I think that's what happened with Amdir. Is he thought I was making the teleological argument. So he was saying, well, I can think of things that are, his objection was, it doesn't have to be intentionalism because I can, if that's what you mean by directed, because I can think of directedness without intention or a person behind it. Like, now, I don't think that's possible. I think there's plenty of literature, especially in philosophy of mind, about intentionality as a mental property. We don't attributed kind of directedness and intentionality in the technical philosophical sense to material objects. But let's say I grant that, and you're missing the point that, but by intentionality, I mean purpose. There's a being who's putting things and directing them. So, in other words, suppose I grant the argument. Sure, maybe not every directedness implies a purposeful agent. However, every purposeful agent acting implies directedness. Do you see that argument?
Yeah, and also to consider the totality of reality or the entire universe, right? It's either purposive and intentional and has a telos, or it doesn't.
Yes. So if there is exactly. So it's really a red herring to get caught up on directedness. I mean, look, there's either an agent who does things and creates the laws, allows for the possibility of knowledge because he has the intention and chooses it. So there's purpose behind everything, teleology in that sense. Or what's the opposite? it would be accident.
Yeah.
So then I think about what accident, like that would be your ultimate principle that you'd have to appeal to. And at that point, you'd have to say what's standing behind everything is the antithesis, the true dichotomy of a purposeful, intentional action, which is, i.e., an accident. So that means I have to explain ultimately everything in terms of like knowledge, accidental knowledge,
Yeah, so
accidental morality, accidental laws of physics.
Right. Everything would
And then
become non-justifiable, right?
Well, not only, yeah, it's self-refuting. For example, when you're reading epistemology, and they have these examples of John is asked how many jelly beans he believes are in the jar, and he says 54. John has a true belief. Somebody says, well, how did you get that true belief, John? It matches reality. There's actually 54 jelly beans in the jar. And John says, it was an accident, I guessed. There was no rhyme or reason behind it. I just kind of guessed. When we say that's not knowledge, you have to have the right reason. So knowledge itself precludes accident. If you study philosophy of science, or even science itself, not only are laws not simply correlation, they preclude accident as well. There's a causal relationship beyond just two things being correlated that has a sort of kind of necessity that precludes accident. So now you have an oxymoron with the accidental laws of physics, and so on and so on. I can keep going through.
Yeah, and I want to address that one of the objections is that the transcendental argument for God does not allow you to come to the particular. I mean, this is really a fundamental misunderstanding of what the argument's about, because you could theoretically pick anything in the worldview to make an argument about. I could start with particulars and make a transcendental argument on the basis of the need for the particular. And so I can make an argument on the basis of the one and the many. That would be relating to the particular. And also he notes that he claims that tag is inherently self-contradictory anytime you come down to a specific particular. Just because it's a paradigm level argument doesn't mean that it doesn't account for or have a belief in particulars. I mean, paradigms include particulars. So
and guess what?
I don't understand even what that objection means.
Guess what? It's another example of missing the.
It's missing the objection. The objection here. So you
I
might just.
This.
Yeah.
How do you know that? How do you know?
Well, he would just say here that tag. I'm not making a claim about paradigms. I'm just telling you a flaw in tag is probably what he would say.
Well, then why is it a flaw? How do you know it's a flaw?
He's saying it's an internal contradiction in tag, I think.
Okay, but that's an epistemic claim about
correct.
What the? So that's why I point out in my paper, even if the details of my argument are incorrect, let's say I messed up somewhere, I still win. We still win. Why? Because of that exact issue right there. Is you're saying it doesn't work, the disjunct doesn't work, or it's flawed this, it's a tautology, those are all epistemic claims. So even if I mess up somewhere, the question still stands. How do you know that? How do you know? And you could say, well, it's an internal critique. Well, then you're putting yourself in a position to know what the paradigm is, why, all kinds of stuff, right? Within the assessment of that, and why that would be, why is that why not critique and
could we just frame the question and make it really quick, simple, and easy and to the point? How do we know knowledge is possible? What if we ask the atheist that? How do we know knowledge is possible? Not, can you give me your list of knowledge claims and beliefs, but how do we know knowledge is possible?
Yeah, that's all I'm trying to do. That's all I'm trying to ask. And they won't answer it.
So let's ask the atheist that in the chat. So we've got several skeptics and kind of people who are disagreeing, which is fine. The question is, how do we know knowledge is possible? And every attempt at answering that you give clearly presupposes that you have knowledge. So it's missing the point. Exactly. So we want an account for knowledge itself, not your knowledge claims, but an account for knowledge. That's what you have to address. That's the point.
Yeah, that's an excellent way to put it. And so, these are kind of more sophisticated details that I go into in the paper.
One more question on that. Is that a good way to phrase it too? Because at this point, a lot of times people are going to say, well, look, I don't know about all this why can't we just look to science and the pragmatic conclusions that we get from the doing of science? Maybe that's a more reliable, pragmatic approach. Why do we even have to busy ourselves with these kind of abstract kind of questions that you're asking? So that they'll oftentimes defer to saying that you're just doing a lot of word salad and fancy tap dancing and why do we even have to? I guess he rage quit. We're done. So I'm just joking.
I'm out of here.
Why can't we just go to science and the pragmatic value of the data that we get from science? That's a typical kind of move I hear at this point.
I mean, it's the same question. Why ought I to take that? I hear what you're saying. I hear you're making claims about that. Now justify why that's a justifiable move. I should take, and what you'll find is they'll assume exactly what they're attempting to prove. Number two, and I didn't even get into this. So that's the question of why should I even accept a sort of kind of pragmatism of science? Why would that even be a good move for me to do? And how would that be a justification? The second problem is science and pragmatics never even get to truth or knowledge. Far from. You've seen in the other papers that I've written for a couple different issues too. One is the Quine-Duheim's indeterminacy of data. You can construct multiple contradictory theories that all work.
Yeah, the data doesn't tell you which paradigm is correct because data can fit multiple paradigms.
You never get the truth, knowledge, or justification from science, and because it works. And number two, all of those are going to be making universal claims from particulars, and you have the problem of induction and the problem of circularity with induction too. So you're back epistemic bootstrapping again, and you don't even get to the category.
Well, basically that move that we just mentioned, the let's just do a pragmatic move to scientific data. That's really just surrendering epistemology and justification. That's essentially saying we can't do it. It's not possible. There is no answer. There's no such thing as justification. That's basically a throwing up your hands and giving up. At that point, then argumentation is no longer possible, right?
And the number three is pragmatism is arbitrary because you just pick arbitrarily the goals that you want to work without any justification.
Yeah, how do we know what does it mean to work, right? I mean, that assumes that you've chosen a criteria, some sort of benchmark of value judgments to judge the thing that works versus the one that doesn't work, which again makes it arbitrary.
And so it goes back to the same, all the same issues that I'm bringing up. But I really like the way that you put it is, how do we know or justify anything that you're saying?
Yeah,
that knowledge exists.
How do we know knowledge is even possible? What's because that's prior to all of your first order claims, and the atheists just never understand that the Transcendental Argument is about second order questions and justification. Now Philip said, where was his last statement? Yeah, but let's see. He had a comment about Socrates as an example that we could address. Where is it? I've already lost it. Socrates does the same thing where he goes out and questions worldviews and he doesn't assert his own. Was Socrates therefore justified in doing internal critiques? Well, my response to this, I'll let Father Deacon give a response, is that now maybe in the Apology he didn't prefer a worldview, but in the rest of the dialogues he does actually assert a worldview. It's called Platonism. So Platonism does assert quite a bit. It's very metaphysical. And in fact, I mean, some of the same types of transcendental presuppositional argumentation, you can find that in Plato. Platonic dialogues ask some of the types of questions that we're asking. Aristotle also does transcendental type moves in argumentation. However, the fact that Socrates is questioning worldviews does not make his own position justified. And that's also not what we're doing. We're not saying that just because we question worldviews, they're not justified. Or excuse me, ours is therefore justified. Let me read you what he says, Father Deacon. Socrates did the same thing and questioned worldviews without asserting his own. Was Socrates justified in doing an internal critique, was his question.
Well, why would this gentleman think that we haven't asserted our worldview?
That's a good point. Yeah, he says, why ought we have a competing worldview in order to do an internal critique of another worldview? Oh, so he's saying that you're doing an ought move. No, that we're not saying that you ought. We're saying that everybody necessarily has a worldview, even if they recognize it or not. It's impossible to have no worldview, even if you're I'm a total agnostic. Well, that's still a position on epistemology.
Exactly, because you just moved it to a higher order and assume a whole bunch of epistemic things to even make those statements. So I mean, the skeptic and the Gnostic, they don't get out of this problem. Well,
no, this is a very common objection. I'm glad we're hitting on this, because a lot of times the atheists will then say, "Oh, well, actually, I don't have any worldview, and I have no commitments. I'm totally neutral. Yeah. I'm totally agnostic on everything. So you can't critique me. There's nothing that you can get me on."
Then watch what they do. You make an argument, right? And it's a sleight of hands. So they told you, I'm not going to do this, right? While they slip in their other hand, right? And start making a bunch of, that doesn't work. You can't do that. See, the tag doesn't, I'm doing an internal critique, right? Well, wait a minute, you're doing the exact thing that you said that you're not committed to doing. So again, all of these things are sleights of hands and cons and stuff like that, and you just gotta
address that more specifically. Why is it a sleight of hand con move if I'm a total agnostic, and then I start critiquing your position and saying, "Oh, you're contradicting yourself, theist." Why am I violating my agnostic stance by using these logical arguments to call you out on contradiction?
Because they just assume, or they just said, I don't have any commitment on logic, contradiction, semantics, observation, experience, right? Because they're saying that because of the next move, they'll come in and be like, I hear what you're saying and it's wrong. You're contradicting. So, oh, wow. Now you're slipping in. All of those are observational statements and epistemic statements that you said I've bracketed, and I'm non-committal with that.
Yeah, so, and well, I mean, just to say, if the same type of person is always saying something like Christianity contradicts itself, then they turn around and say, I have no logical commitments to or philosophical commitments to anything. Well, you just invoked the law of non-contradiction, so you exactly.
do. And I really think it's a character flaw too, because think about the person who can't actually commit to anything, like any dates or meetings or anything like that. Well,
what if they're a genuine sort of skeptic or a genuine person who says, I just don't know which, I've had a lot of philosophy classes and I don't know which one's true. Like there's a lot of positions out there.
Come in and start telling you that your argument's wrong. That's usually what a genuine person who's
well, what if they said, well, I'm just arguing the positions to see who's got the better case, right?
Well, yeah, that might not be a disingenuous person or a character flaw, but then they're just confused. We'd have to just kind of show them, but do you see that you're committing to something, a methodology or access to a methodology or some sort of standard or lenses or anything by which you think that you could actually assess and figure this stuff out?
All right, now we have some questions here in the super chats, comments. Gnome's body.
Just 1 second. I gotta grab my nose is getting. I get
Okay.
my nose spray real quick. 1 second.
I'll go ahead and read this and then comment on it, reading it for him. Gnome's body, $10. Can perception of information be relative to the human mind? There might be a subjective element to the incoming data, which the human mind misinterprets or distorts or doesn't want to see or know, right? That they might suppress or misinterpret the data or something like that. But I wouldn't say that the perception of information is therefore completely relative just because there can be instances of misinterpretation. I am not entirely convinced that knowledge is transcendent. Well, knowledge can be had by human beings that is not transcendent. There is knowledge of the transcendent. So if you mean, it's a little ambiguous what you mean by that. So I wouldn't say that knowledge is like necessarily always transcendent. We're saying that knowledge itself requires the transcendent to be grounded. Thank you for being better than a lot of the other online apologists. What you say makes me think. Well, I appreciate that, Gnome's body. Good question. Do you want to comment on that? Can perception of information be purely relative to the human mind?
Let's say that again.
Can perception of information be relative to the human mind? In other words, is it possible for the incoming information or data to like be relative to each person getting the data?
I don't think so, because this is kind of similar to like Wittgenstein's "there's no private language."
Yeah,
so
that's a great point.
Yeah, the fact is there's commensurability and there's clues to that. If that were actually the case, we
could never talk to each other, right?
We could never actually talk to each other. So if everything was completely subjective, we wouldn't be able to relate with one another. We wouldn't be able to develop language. And so, although, like you said, well, certainly the mind can kind of contaminate the sense data that kind of comes in, skew it and stuff like that. It can't, and there's this kind of subjective element and kind of imposing and stuff that could happen. It couldn't be absolute. Otherwise, we wouldn't be understanding each other or developing a language.
Yeah, there's a lot of fascinating transcendental argumentation that is just kind of sitting out there, ready to be, the depths of it, ready to be plumbed. Some philosophers like Carl Otto Appel have done this, where they look at the logical structure of languages. And even though languages differ, there's actually fundamental necessary things going on in every language, everywhere. So for the possibility of language at all, you've got to have certain structures in place to make
which makes sense,
meaning
the logical,
possible. Yeah.
Transcendental categories.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, they're necessary for language. That's why, I mean, like 5 or 6 years ago, every time I was doing tag, I was just going back into like language meaning arguments, because every time an atheist makes it's similar to what you're doing with like knowledge claims. I can just say that every time an atheist makes a sentence, he's assuming all kinds of linguistic structures that he hasn't proven yet.
Absolutely.
Homicidal self-conscious cake, $1. What do you think of this claim? Epistemology is the expression of a reductionist ontology that infuses the entire Western tradition. Thus, epistemology reduces all being to some mere presence. It forces all knowledge to conform to some single standard. My response would be, I'm assuming that that's a Heidegger quote. I think you were saying, unless I'm mixing up with somebody else, that you were interested in a response to this Heidegger objection. Sometimes the German idealists would, and people after them would be very critical of certain schools of epistemology that would reduce ontology to some minimalist, like hyper-rationalist type of, not rationalist, because German idealists were rationalists. What am I trying to say? Like a reductionist, like a materialist type of move, right? So let's say epistemology in the modern sense develops in this anti-metaphysical stance of like Kant and Hume. So it's probably a critique, but maybe he's going back to Plato and saying that all epistemic search for truth is somehow reductionist against being. I mean, this has to be from Heidegger, but I'm not well studied in Heidegger to know if this is the case. I mean, in terms of his views, but I would just say that, I mean, it shouldn't be odd to think of epistemology as a discipline itself somehow being like necessarily flawed. I mean, we're just asking the question of what is knowledge? Is knowledge possible? How do we know? What does it mean to know? I don't see why that would be inherently problematic, but I'm sure Heidegger has some take that, like back to Plato was a problem or something.
Yeah. Again, it just kind of goes back to my paper too. I'm staying general enough in these considerations that I'm not wedding myself to any kind of particular view, particular metaphysics, particular epistemology. Because there was a guy that was saying, well, you're redefining knowledge. And I'm like, I'm not redefining knowledge. That I'm giving you, because again, these are such fundamental and prior questions. I'm giving you everything that you want, whatever you would say, right? It still stands that there's these kinds of questions, exactly like you said. How do we know that knowledge exists? I don't know. Anybody can't like it's really.
Yeah, I think if Heidegger said to you, Father Deacon, epistemology is the expression of a reductionist ontology that infuses the entire Western tradition, and you've missed being, right? I mean, it's kind of like his system building project to dismiss any sort of epistemology argument that you're making. So how would you respond to like a Heidegger man that is sort of dismissing epistemology arguments as some sort of reductionist expression?
I would just tell him your present at hand, Bastan, standing reserve, and its projectedness has confused the ontic and ontis relationship on your own metaphysical and epistemological grounds, bracketing, and I just throw out a bunch of Heidegger words to him, back and watch and see what he does. No, I'm kidding. Yeah, I would basically try to work through with him and say, can we get past that? Like, I'm not going to make any commitments. Help me. And again, phenomenologists can be good with the kind of language. One of the things that Heidegger was trying to do is the exact task that I'm doing, is this kind of deconstruction project, right? That there's like all these layers, paradigms and language and stuff like that. And he's trying to get down to primordial being, right? And so that he doesn't have to kind of think through incorrect categories. So he's stripping off the layers. I'd basically say that to Heidegger. Why don't you help me? Maybe I'm not good at my words and arguments. So why don't you help me? Because he's obviously much smarter than me. I know what you're doing, though. You're wanting to get into more kind of primordial, basic kind of questions. And that's what I want to do. How would you, Heidegger, help me phrase this question? How do we know that we know?
Yeah, and I think that just responding with things like, oh, we have to plunge into being or find being is really missing the point, right? Because, I mean, first of all, what does it even mean to say, I mean, being, this is like the most generic term in the history of philosophy, right? I mean, it has all kinds of different meanings in different philosophies.
And the thing you always notice about philosophers, they have these wonderful proposals. Well, I'm going to get rid of all this stuff.
And then their answer is something dumb, right?
Well, not only that, they bring in the exact stuff they're trying to get rid of.
The same problems remain.
Look at this. Husserl's discovery of reduction. So I bet that's what. But did you notice this was Dermot Moran's phenomenology here? But I find that funny. I keep noticing this throughout philosophy. You know, Descartes brings in the stuff that he's trying to get rid of. The people responding to Descartes, like, we got to get rid of this stuff, right? And this dualism, right? We're going to materialism, and identity theory, and then they bring in conceptual dual. Like,
yeah, I think a lot of people misunderstand that what we're saying is that philosophy is a failed project. So from the pre-Socratics to today, philosophy is a giant failed enterprise. And I think that people, when they hear us saying that, they're like, what? Because aren't you talking a bunch of philosophy jargon and baggage and word salad? And are you going back to Plato and pre-Socratics and using these terms? Correct. Because, yeah, sometimes they say things that are correct and true. But our whole point is that all of these secular and man-made autonomous system-building projects are always doomed to fail. And that's why they always have these fundamental problems in their systems. John 750, I've encountered many atheists that claim that atheism is not a paradigm. It is simply a non-belief based on the fact that there's no evidence for God. Can you please explain why atheism is actually a paradigm and why there's no such thing as a, quote, non-belief of theism? Thank you.
Yeah, so, I mean, I'll grant to him and be like, all right, it's not a paradigm. My position is
well, hold on, but wouldn't it be the case that even though the claim of atheism itself is not equivalent to a paradigm, that person still has paradigm level commitments?
Yes, that's true. Paradigm level commitments. In other words, in my paper, there's nobody that's not presuppositionalist, right? In order for you to make a statement about that, again, it goes all the way back to everything I was saying about the second order. You're taking positions. You have a paradigm in which you make that, whether you realize it or not. And so I just feel like it's again, it's a dishonest and ad hoc move. I don't have it. It's like, well, then you deceived yourself. Like, I mean, it's clear you have a set of, like, what is a paradigm?
Yeah, it's basic beliefs about knowledge, ethics, and metaphysics, right? So that's all it is.
So you can't open your mouth and make any claims and be like, that just came out of nowhere, right? That I literally have no beliefs.
Correct. Yeah, everybody has some commitments, even if you're a complete like skeptic / agnostic. Those are beliefs. Those are positions, right? You're basically saying that I and pretty much no one else can know, or we just don't know, or I don't know. I mean, that's still a commitment to all kinds of different things. And you may not think that it is, but it is.
And I think what they'll say too, okay, I'll grant that, but there's no common denominator of which you can categorize atheism as a worldview or position. It's like, absolutely, that's what the whole paper's about. You're accidentalists.
Exactly. Like yeah, they didn't even realize that they already have a commitment to accidentalism by just saying that. That's the point. So in other words, saying that is already a commitment. It entails all of these positions, whether you've recognized it or not. So the fact that you haven't recognized it doesn't mean that you don't have all of these commitments.
You don't have it.
John Bowlerman, $10. Thank you, gentlemen. I'm from Vancouver, a.k.a. the New Sodom. Thank you so much. Anonymous, $5. I've been listening to this for a long time. Only just now I have the courage to pipe up. Jay, you've been very edifying. Thank you for being a nerd who does my homework for me. Glory to Jesus. Thank you so much. Kristen, $5. Thank you. Thank you, Kristen. Sarah from Craig, $10. If we can't reason accurately from a fallen nature to God because of death, couldn't tag fall into the same error? No, I mean, we're not saying that you can't reason accurately because of the fall per se. You can. I mean, an atheist can write a paper about mathematics, can write papers about earthworms that are correct and make new discoveries. Rather, the point is that they can't justify how knowledge is possible. So those are two different. That's another example of the second order, right? So let's give an example of an atheist writes a science paper, some breakthrough discovery about earthworms, because he's been studying for the 20 years, and it turns out it's all true. His theories on earthworms are correct, okay? Nobody's saying that he doesn't have the first order knowledge about the earthworms and his research and data. What we're saying is that he's not able to give an account for how that knowledge is possible. Yes. That's the higher order claim. This should be obvious if people think about it, that these are two different things, two different claims. This
Tell
guy,
me out here.
yeah.
I'm still confused with this guy saying that tag can't differentiate particulars. Have you figured out what that means?
I mean, I addressed that earlier that, you could make a transcendental argument with anything within the paradigm. I could start with pencils and make the argument up to God. It wouldn't matter what object you pick, because ultimately it's the same question of how do we ground the knowledge of those objects, right? So
is that the question he was asking?
He seems to think that somehow tag is only dealing with universals. It's not a question of universals and particulars.
Okay.
So he thinks that it's a universal type argument, I think, and therefore there's not a basis for particulars, seems to be what he thinks it is. Tag is not the equivalent of universals. Okay.
So, and remember, too, that...
It's always misunderstanding everything.
Yeah, people get confused because they hear the word transcendental in...
Yeah, and they think that's reasoning about universals or something like...
Yeah, so. Or the all transcendental categories or transcendental arguments must be about the reasoning about or grounding transcendental categories. And that's not the case. So transcendental comes from the transcendental deduction of Kant. And it basically, a transcendental is simply just what's prior, right? Transcendare, what's over and above and prior that makes the stuff below.
Yeah, possible. Well, maybe preconditions is better, because if we talk about preconditions for knowledge, then that really doesn't have anything to do with the question of universals per se. You might ask, are there universals, and can you give an argument for universals in your worldview? But preconditions for knowledge, though it might relate to that, is not the same thing as the question of universals. So hopefully that clears it up.
Because remember, in just general methodology of the transcendental deduction, Kant is actually trying to answer that exact question of what makes it possible to make predicates of particulars, sense data, right? Sense data and entities and stuff like that. So that's exactly what a transcendental argument, generally speaking, I'm not saying Kant pulls it off, but like the type of inference or transcendental deduction that's an argument that's making is specifically attempting to ground and distinguish between particular.
Well, yeah, I mean, all of Aristotle's categories at the beginning is dealing with how to pick out and know objects, and to give the relations that make them what they are, right? So quantity, position, substance, right? These are all different things that are listed in the category, and then Kant takes that and then tries to make his structure of the categories, and rather than them being metaphysics, they're just in the mind. So it's the same basic idea of what categories are, to make knowledge of objects possible. That's
necessary the whole point. Preconditions,
right.
Yeah.
So in other words, to have knowledge of an object, right? If we looked at Aristotle's categories, I would need to know that it is one of the things, the categories I would need to know is it is over there, and over there is 5 feet from that thing, and it's 10 feet from this thing, right? That's the position and relation is one of the things he lists in those categories. Then he says, what about the fact that our relationship to transcendental categories seems contingent on fallen nature? I would not say that at all. It has nothing to do with transcendental categories. Have nothing to do with being contingent on fallen nature. So I don't know what you said that you say look up the laws of physics. I don't know how that relates. Thank you for everything that you're doing. 1 Corinthians 1:23. Frankie D, $5. My brother and me, Austin, came up with a new form of calculating how far away a different location is. For example, if you look at a place, we might say it is 1 Jay Dyer stream away. And if they say it is 2 Jay Dyer streams away, you know it's very far. That's creative.
That's hilarious.
Jeb, $5. Father Deacon Ananias, question for you. Can there be a contradiction between first order and second order thinking? For example, let's say somebody says in the first order statement, the law of identity does not exist. Would that result in a contradiction with a second order statement that they know that the law of identity doesn't exist?
Yeah. And then what's really interesting too, that, I mean, this gets really meta level, but it's something I developed with my argument from the immateriality of the intellect. And with like Boolean logic, you can't have existential import with universal propositions. So that means if you derive a particular, I'll give you an example. All dogs are animals. On the Boolean interpretation, that has no existential import. But if you say some dogs are animals, it does. It implies dogs exist. All right. So then comes Alfred Tarski, and Alfred Tarski makes this distinction between language, object language, and meta language. So this is when we first start getting into this kind of first and second order, and eventually this is going to develop into first and second order logic. So I started thinking about a statement. Now, the reason why Tarski developed that was because of the liar paradox. This sentence is false. And he was able to make, do you see how the second and first order is relevant? He's able to make a distinction between the language that talks about objects versus language that talks about the language. And so something could be both true and false depending on that distinction. Anyways, so then I was thinking about, because I'm doing all this work with second order statements.
Yeah, but by the way, that doesn't exist, right? Because J. Mike and some of the other atheists said there was no such thing as that question. So
okay.
So even though the philosophers are out here talking about it, it's famous discussion. It doesn't exist because there's no such thing.
I'll make sure to get in my science.
It's a nonsense thing that you've made up that you could talk about the language of objects. So there's knowledge of objects, and then there's discussions of the language of the knowledge of objects. That doesn't exist. It's a thing that's made up by you.
Well, I'll make sure to go into. I put my time machine in every being of patristic faith right here. So I'll make sure to actually go into my bag of patristic faith coffee, which you can purchase on in the bio from Jay's. So
yeah, I'll put the link in the chat. This is real coffee too, by the way. Organic, Orthodox based company. I'll put the link. And every being
is a second order being that actually talks about lower order beings, and I think you'll really appreciate the meta level roast of this particular blend. But I've also put a time machine in here, so I'll make sure to actually go into my bag of Pacific Faith, go back in time and tell Tarski, I'm sorry to tell you, Tarski, the internet atheist keyboard wizard.
By the way, isn't this the whole Douglas Hofstadter book that was a Pulitzer Prize winner, Gödel Asher Bach? Right? Where do you know what I'm talking about?
Yes. I have it back here somewhere.
Yeah, where he talks about strange loops, and the whole point is that there's language, and then there's language about language, and then he talks about how MC Escher's artwork displays the like geometric patterns that evidence this strange loop principle, that if you're just raising the question one step above, one higher order. He says
okay, so I want to answer that question real quick. I'm sorry for going on a tangent on that. So anyways, think about this second order claim. All propositions or all sentences contain words. That's a meta language, right? Why? Because I'm using language to talk about the object language of words.
Right.
Okay, so what happens, that's an universal proposition, and therefore I conclude to a particular, therefore some words, some sentences contain words. Have I committed on the Boolean interpretation an existentialist fallacy? And I came to this discovery. I actually wrote mathematicians and logicians, and nobody's even thought about this, which is weird. Stuff that seems so basic that I'm like, why has nobody ever thought about this? It can't apply to second order. The Boolean existential import rules can't apply to second order. Why? Because to answer your friend's question in the chat, I would be making a second order claim that's basically contradictory, right? I'm speaking about words and concepts and universals, but they don't exist. Do you see the problem? So to answer
Yeah,
the
because the
person's question,
sentence is
absolutely.
engaging in it. So the sentence itself, yeah.
Absolutely. You could make second order claims about first order things in which you're engaged in contradiction. And it's something that I just actually worked out in recently.
Yeah, when I was talking to Amdir, I brought up the Gödel, the move that Gödel makes, and he was like, "That's not a transcendental argument." I wasn't arguing that Gödel was making a transcendental argument. I was saying that the move that he makes from in the argument against Russell, when he makes the set argument, he says that every set eventually appeals outside of the set, and that's an example of the strange loop stuff in the Hofstadter book. Illustrates the point that you're making about the move up to second order and the Tarski point.
It's actually a fun book to read.
It's really difficult. He's got his other books are really difficult too, Metamagical Themas. But I mean, Hofstadter's. I mean, he's not engaged in a lot of metaphysical. Well, actually, he kind of is, because he says maybe we can reconcile some of these things with like Zen philosophy, and he talks about Zen cones and how Zen's philosophy sometimes makes the same move to first order, second order, but the move is the same. That's the point. It's not saying that is the transcendental argument. I'm not saying that MC Escher's artwork exemplifying this move is the transcendental argument. It's really stupid, but anyway, yeah. If anybody just watches, there's actually some lectures that explain the Gödel Escherbach book to you. It's a really difficult book, but if you watch some of those lectures, you'll see the point that we're making here about how, whether it's Bach's, at the beginning chapters, he gives an example of Bach's fugue, one of his like fugues, and it's actually the musical structure repeats. So it's a never-ending loop. If you play it on those old-timey pianos or whatever, it would just play in a loop, and it would be the same structure over and over and over. And you could.
By the way,
yeah,
I actually did want to. There's a much better argument than the tag. It's completely an irrefutable proof, but the problem is it's such advanced logic that none of the atheists would be able to understand it. So I never actually used that one. But if you come up to Montanica, I might actually pull it out just so we could actually look at it. Nobody's
one of the great challenges in this world.
Trust me, it's an infallible proof, because I'm much smarter than all of you on logic, and so you're gonna have to just trust me on this. I actually was thinking about, like, what if I came up with an argument like that? Well, I do have a proof, but it's just far too complicated for you to understand what the atheist would actually say.
Yeah, there is Hofstadter giving a lecture in 2013 explaining the book and explaining the principle of strange loop. So if you want to watch that lecture, you'll get an idea about what we're talking about. Yeah. I wish he had used some graphics, but it's kind of like just him talking. He should have used some imagery, because his book is actually full of a lot of images. But anyway, so the next question is, Frankie D. On a serious note, I've been struggling with Nietzsche. There's a guy whose name is Kostin Alamaru. He argues that Plato and Nietzsche were arguing for an aristocracy, and that philosophy is therefore not real. It's only a tool of statecraft. Well, I mean, that would be a theory, but the fact that he has this theory doesn't mean that it's true. So I'll throw this one to Father Deacon. What would you say to somebody who said, look, Plato, Nietzsche, they've shown us ultimately the real meaning of their philosophy is that there's an aristocratic elite. There's not a real philosophy. It's just a tool of control, man.
Well, suppose I grant that there's a certain element of they're using. Suppose I grant that they're still telling me, if that's really who Nietzsche and Plato are, there's still something viable about philosophy because it exposes the con. And I would agree somewhat with that, right? I think all the philosophers are basically con artists. Yet I engage in philosophy. In other words, philosophy in the general sense of thinking correctly and with excellence, that you could train yourself in that how would you fight bad philosophy of the elites or something like that with good philosophy, right? Good thinking skills. So even if I granted that, that's kind of the move that I would take.
Well, I mean, would this argument still be some kind of philosophy and therefore self-refuting because it's...
That's what I'm saying. Either it's self-refuting or they're still saying there's some advantage to use this to expose the con. So...
And what would you say to like a Nietzschean who says something like, your quest for absolute truth is silly. Everything is just sort of, will to power dynamics, and you're just duped into thinking that you're finding this absolute truth.
It's an absolute claim. So it's the same problem with this. It's like, oh, I'm going to pretend I'm not making second order claims that are contingent upon the first order. So just grant me my assumption, right? There are no absolutes, so I can make an absolute statement about there are no absolutes. It's like...
Mindhack, $5. Thank you so much. Roby, $10. Do you think that something deeper concerning knowledge was distorted in the confusion of the languages at the Tower of Babel? I don't know. I mean, maybe it's possible that humanity's knowledge was damaged in some weird way at that time, but I mean, it looks like as per Daniel 11 or 12, knowledge is increasing as we get towards the end. So good question. I don't know. Frodrick, $5. Do you have any thoughts on Mila Sue's necessity of contingency, appearing like he accidentally stumbled across St. Maximus's, where God exists, I do not. Where I exist, God does not. I don't know what that means, honestly. So, I mean, I've read a lot of St. Maximus, but I don't know what that means. Maximus is probably just trying to express apophatic theology, that the inner being of God, in terms of his essence, will never know that. I'll never be there. I'll never perceive it. And it might be a statement of humility too, like, where I exist, God does not exist, just in the sense of like, because I'm sinful, I don't feel close to God. But Maximus isn't literally saying that God's not omnipresent. So, but I mean, I'm just guessing because I don't know who Melasu is or what this argument is. Mindhack, $5. Is there any atheist that you could think of who does a decent account giving a justification for knowledge claims? Father Deacon.
My PhD advisor is an atheist that does pretty good.
Oh, really?
And he's a Kantian scholar. He's a Solarzian scholar. And it's a sophisticated account of... It's people like that I think of. I would say Malpass, but he... As far as I know, Malpass kind of takes more of like an agnostic, like, I don't know, kind of position, but typically like at the level of like a good academic professor or something like that, they could give you a good run for your money if that's what... I mean, I think again it misses the kind of greater points of missing the epistemological forest for the epistemic trees and getting bogged down on... I just saw this in like one of the comments too, like the tag doesn't work because it fits into one of Kant's categories, and probably referring back to Stroud's argument of the lack of verification principle and transcendental deductions, that it can never establish an object to which it... And two problems here. And it's, again, it's this, I hate to say it, this pretended autonomy and kind of holding on to your idols so that you can't actually see the question. It's like, why is anything that Kant said even true or justified? And we're just granting Kant like his arguments work and everything that he said, let me get my cat out of the way, actually works. And again, it's just missing the more kind of fundamental kind of question of, even if my argument doesn't work, tag, it still works, right? Let me put it this way to you. What comes first? The necessary condition for all arguments, including transcendental arguments, or the transcendental arguments? Which one comes first, epistemically speaking? What would you say?
I was reading Philip's comment. I missed what you were saying. I apologize.
So one way to kind of illustrate why none of these people's objections will ever work. I want to ask them, epistemically speaking, what comes first? The necessary conditions for arguments, including transcendental arguments, or the transcendental argument?
The
Which
conditions.
one comes first?
The conditions would have to come first.
Yeah, the necessary conditions. So what that means is, even if my transcendental argument fails, the question still stands. Do you see what I mean? Why? Because
yeah, I mean, like, yeah,
and
right. I mean, let's say that somebody was engaged, like, was arguing very poorly, right? Let's say they argued tag very poorly, like, I don't know, a lot of the Matt Slick or one of these people, right? Let's say they argued it very poorly. Like, the question is still there, right?
Yes. And that's what I'm saying. Even if I granted it to you that, like, the tag is open to these Kantian critiques of Stroud and blah, 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 and all this different stuff, or I made a mistake or something like that, the question, all it means is I wasn't that great with my language. The argument prior to argument still stands, doesn't it?
Yeah, and this
So
was
that's what I
my
mean.
this was
There's
my
really
point
nothing
to
to say.
Amdir or J Mike, I forget which one, but yeah, this was the point I was making to them. BMX 1966, $10. Thank you so much for that. Big Boss, $20. Dang, the FDA, Food and Drug Administration, is against people playing tag. When will the tyranny end? So he's doing a little bit of pun with your name and other things like tag. Attack, thank you so much, Big Boss, appreciate it. Attack Dog, $505. Jay, I'm just starting to understand, get into pre-sup. I'm slow boy. What are the top 5 books or papers or essays for a noob that doesn't have a philosophy background? I would say watch the Bonson-Stein debate about 2 or 3 times and take notes. I would say read the very easy introduction book, Ultimate Proof by Dr. Jason Lyle. Then I would read something like Always Ready by Greg Bahnsen, and then I would read Father Deacon Ananias' papers, and I would read then Contingency of Knowledge by Russ Mannion. All right, guys, I want to remind you that we do have a show sponsor who is Chalk.com. Now, is your paper public or not yet?
Yes. Here, I'm just going to throw it into the...
Because a lot of people were saying, hey, we want to read this. And we got through several key points, but we didn't get through every single thing because it's, it's not super long. It's a 12-page paper, but so if you guys want to read the paper, Father Deacon will give you the link right somewhere there. There it is.
There it is, okay. Academia.edu. Somebody told me that unless you subscribe to academia.edu, you can't download the PDF.
Well, you have to log in with like your Facebook or your Google is how you do that.
Okay. You can read it though, like it's in
Yeah,
there,
you can read it, but
to
download you have to be logged in through Facebook or Google.
Okay, thanks for...
Yeah, and
I
guys,
think almost all my papers are on there.
Remember to head on over to Chalk.com for the best in supplementation. You can get the Male Vitality Stack, which will include there on the front page of Chalk.com, CHOQ.com, both the Action 2.0, the Tonkat Ali, and the pre-workout, the Chalk Chad Mode. Chad Mode is the best for pre-workouts. It does not include any toxic material. It doesn't have any flavor additives that are coming out of a GMO hybrid Frankenstein underground base. It's all better than organic, stringently purified to the max. They're extremists about their purification over there at chalk.com. So head on over there, use promo code J50, you get 50% off. And that's not just for dudes. There's also stacks for women. So if you're one of the 5% of ladies that watch this channel out of the 95% of dudes, you can also benefit from chalk.com by using the promo code J50, that's JAY50, to get 50% off. And also, if you want recurring subscriptions, you can use the promo code JAY53LIFE, JAY53LIFE. And good news, guys, we will be doing an event in Vegas in June. So look for the Vegas June event. Father Deacon, I don't know if you've sold your tickets to your event. If you want to plug that, you can.
Yeah, so the 21st ends the Orthodox Montanica discount tickets, the early bird tickets. So get those. We are expected to sell out. We're way ahead of where we were with ticket sales last year, and we're going to get a lot more. And also, if many of you don't know, in Missoula, there's a mega church, evangelical church, about 2,000 people that are converting to Orthodoxy. So we'll probably get a lot of them too. So don't procrastinate. Get your tickets. Put it in the chat right there for the conference. And
what's going on at your conference this year? It's themed around, is it film or icons?
The Theology, the icon. So we're going to have famous film directors like Nathan Jacobs, who's also a doctor of philosophy. And I think he was a student of Dr. David Bradshaw at one point. And Father Turbo Qualls, who's an iconography. Also Father Matthew Garrett from Boise, who's an iconographer and Rochor. And Shane Swenson, who is our resident iconographer painting the temple.
Yeah, shout out to Shane, longtime buddy of ours.
Yeah. So, and then it looks like we might get some other film directors and some other famous guests that I had announced.
Stanley Kubrick's coming. Mel Gibson's coming.
Mel Gibson.
That's a joke, Spurgs. That's a joke.
Yeah. Martin Heidegger probably will show up.
Lenny Riefenstahl will be there.
Yeah, that's.
It's
funny. It's a joke.
And the people, yeah. Now they're going to be like, I demand my ticket refunded because you lied and told me that Stanley Kubrick would be there, and he's not here. You're a liar.
What other? If I had to get any film director, who would be your favorite film director to bring in? They don't have to be Orthodox.
Well, I think everybody would prefer Mel Gibson, probably like as the most based film director. I mean, somebody said, is Tom Cruise coming? No, but Tom Coombs is coming, and that's even better. So, you would probably be better situated to know Orthodox directors. I'm trying to think of the only ones I've heard of are the ones that you know about. I think I can't think of any other ones that are.
We could get Nick Cage to come because you know that I've met him and had some conversations with down at the Lava Lounge in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
Oh, you know who we should get? Speaking of Toms.
Who?
Tom Waits.
He has nothing to do with it. Somebody said get Quentin Tarantino to come. Yeah, I don't think that's gonna happen. But anyway, thank you for coming back. My mind is mush. I'm so tired from traveling.
I know,
and all this kind of stuff. So thank you for coming on, and everybody should read the paper. And anything you want to leave us with?
All of you we're halfway through Lent. Have a great rest of Lent. May God give you the grace necessary for that. Again, you've got our Patristic Faith coffee. Jay, I know that you're starting up some, I think going to be releasing some courses. After Pascha, I'm going to start releasing some new courses, Canvas courses, so stay tuned. Also, we're bringing on other PhD Orthodox philosophy professors on the Patristic Faith to deliver courses. So stay tuned. We're really excited about that. And just like you, Jay, we want to provide quality university education that isn't woke, it isn't broke, and it won't cause you to go broke too for an affordable price.
Yeah, I think that's the model. I mean, the future will be this. People are not going to care about these mind control, brainwashing universities, and they're going to be moving to learning what they want to learn on their own initiative. And that's a much better model anyway. So that's what I think the future is. So yeah, it's good to hear that. Big Boss sends another $5 and says, if you don't subscribe to Jay's analysis, you're psyoping yourself. That's a good selling point. I like it. So yeah, you can also subscribe to my website, get access to the archives. I forgot to mention that I did finish this. So if you guys didn't see the really deep dive that we did on Through the Looking Glass, I highly recommend it. Actually, we touched on some of the strange loop stuff because Lewis Carroll, if you didn't know, was a mathematician, and a lot of the word games and wordplay is highly philosophical. In fact, Father Deacon, you might find this interesting. There's elements of the later chapters of Through the Looking Glass that not only deal with the question of identity, but questions of like substance and accident and Aristotelian questions. There's a lot of weird stuff in this book that you wouldn't think about, perhaps even counting by identity versus counting by division, I think comes up. And again, Lewis Carroll was a weirdo for sure, and we covered that in part 1. But he does include a lot of interest. Seriously, he was accused of being a PEDO because of, well, odd things that happened. He was in the circles of a lot of the Golden Dawn ritual magic weirdos. So there's a lot of bizarre stuff with this book and with him. And I'll be doing the part 2 very soon because I just finished it on the plane. And if you don't know, it also has questions relating to like word concept fallacies. So a lot of the stuff that actually, like when she goes into Wonderland, or when she goes through the Looking Glass into the opposite world, the mirror world, everything functions like fallacies are the case. So there's contradictions happening. Words are misunderstood in 2 different references, 2 different senses. And so part of the magic of Wonderland is identifying and picking out things like fallacies and word concept fallacies, etc. So part 2 will be up in the next few days, and thank you for your patience while I was gone hanging out with Sam Hyde. That was a super awesome, very, very thankful. It was a blessing to be able to go do that. Very thankful to them for hosting me up there and putting me up and having me get beat up by the Olympic trainer dude. So I got to do some boxing. It was intense. It was an ascetic endeavor. I really enjoyed it. So anyway, it's going to be a fun PGL when it comes out. And thank you guys so much. And we'll be back very soon. Everybody have a good night.
God bless.